I had this meeting with Steve Jobs, and then that story will become very popular. Within a few days, it'll spread around social media because it's a Steve Jobs story. I wrote an hour-long stage show about my experiences in Silicon Valley with like this much Steve Jobs in it. He took over my show because he's so interesting. He's the most interesting human being I can think of in the last 75 years, counting evil people, good people, inventors, business people.
This is Mike Stern.
And this is Tom Hershenson.
Welcome to General Magic and the Soul of Tech.
We believed we were building something that would change the world, and in some ways we did. In others, we didn't understand what we were setting in motion. The story of General Magic isn't over. We're still living inside what it started.
Our special guest today is Scott Knaster, one of the master storytellers of Silicon Valley. Scott has worked in virtually every household name company in Silicon Valley, starting at Apple, working at General Magic, where the three of us met, but going on to work at Google, at Microsoft, at Danger, Andy Rubin's first mobile telephone startup. Scott has seen, recorded, and lived through some of the seminal experiences that people in the tech world can undergo. Wanted to kind of start off, Scott, by asking you to kind of talk about the different places you've worked and how the experiences differed, from starting at Apple when it was not yet the Apple we know today, and the through line after that.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. That was my General Magic name tag. I guess it wanted to call. Yeah, I started off by falling in love with the company that Apple was in 1983. I was struck by the same thing that so many other people have been struck by, just the image that Apple projected, the soul that was in its products when everybody else was advertising big metal boxes. Apple had an Apple II, and it was beige, and you could open it up. And other people had ads with speeds and feeds and what kind of bus they had and what the CPU was. Apple had an ad with a guy sitting at his kitchen table doing finances, and his wife was in the kitchen too, and she took her turn on the Apple II. So I was just struck by the humanity that Apple brought, and I ended up moving from Colorado to California to work for the company. Um, and I wasn't an engineer ever. I never made any hardware or software, but I was really good at learning things and teaching other people. So I did support and writing. I started at Apple, did that for a few years, and moved on to a lot of the other places you mentioned, trying to find, I guess, the most Apple-like or the most human or humanitarian place in all of those companies. Um, and General Magic certainly felt that way, maybe even more than Apple itself. By the time I went there in 1990, I felt really privileged to get to be at General Magic in the early days with people like Bill and Andy, who were my heroes in tech, because like I said, I never made any software, I never built any hardware, but they needed somebody to explain all this to developers, and that I could do. Um, and then at the other places, really similar. I was always looking for something that that touched people, that wasn't just about technology, but was about um, something fun or interesting or life improving. Although that might be a little bit lofty of a goal. I didn't. If I'd wanted that, I probably would have joined the Peace Corps. But I loved the idea of using technology to see where we could go as people, as humanity. And so I got to be, the best part was getting to be around all these incredible projects and super smart, usually thoughtful people. Um, and then one through line in particular that's really affected me now is at General Magic, I learned the tradition of storytelling in tech. And I learned it from Andy Hertzfeld, and Darren Adler was there, were very, this was very important to them. And they would sit us all down. We would sit around and tell stories uh, fairly often. I think Andy said he got it from Woz. I'm not sure where Woz got it from, but I guess it's been passed on. And from this, I learned that this was probably my thing that I ought to do, is tell stories. And so blogs came along, and I started writing them in blogs. and then my life took a surprising left turn, and I ended up, performing on stage, in shows and musicals, and decided to start telling these stories on stage, and that was incredibly fulfilling. And now I guess we're in an age of Substack, so it's the blog reborn maybe. So, I decided to start writing all my stories down before I forget them, which is starting to happen. So now I can look things up in my own archive on Substack, and I really have fun putting those out. And I think, like you suggested, um, I lived through all this stuff, and I kept it all.
Yeah, I think you have one of the stellar collections, other than the Computer History Museum, anywhere in the Bay Area, at least, of great artifacts. Because you share some of them online, and they're terrific. Two things before I turn it back to Tom. One, you were one of the earliest employees at General Magic. I mean, I was one of the first 20, and you were there long before I was. Um, was it an Apple thing, or was it something that Andy and Bill themselves particularly wanted to do? That you were a technical writer, to use the old term, but you were writing the documentation both for users and for developers. But you were there at the beginning, before there was a product, before there was before there was a mock-up of a product. Um, that's really unusual. Was that unique to us, or was that an Apple thing?
I don't think it was an Apple thing. I think it was unusual, and I think it was kinda like, you know, draft the best player, technique in football and in sports in general. Um, I was around and, available, and they knew they would need somebody like me eventually, and people there knew me, so that's how I got in. And I was number 14, by the way, and, the way the way I got in is a bit of a Silicon Valley story too, which is at Apple. I was working at Apple, and there was an experiment called Rumor Monger, written by Harry Chesley, and this was a really a wonderful, uh, Apple Talk based, um, piece of software that you ran on your computer, and it talked to other clients running the software on other computers, and you could type in a message like, "Hello from Deanza 1," and it would float out anonymously. That's important, uh, on the network and other people would randomly see this message, and after many clients, many people typing many messages, um, you didn't see every message, you just saw what the program picked for you at random. So it was chaotic and anarchic, and it was shut down before too long. But but before it was shut down, I saw a message float by one day that said, "Phil Goldman is leaving Apple for General Magic." I didn't know what General Magic was. I knew Phil, and I heard that he was there was a going away party. So I walked across the street to the going away party, found out about General Magic, and talked to Dan Winkler, who, of course, was at General Magic very early, working on the scripting language for Magic App, Magic Script. And I had known Dan because we wrote a book together about HyperTalk. So Dan was kind of my ticket and said, "Oh, we're going to need a technical writer. Maybe it could be you." And I interviewed, and I knew Andy a little bit, Bill not at all, Mark not at all. Um, and I didn't need to be wowed, but they wowed me, and they decided they could spend a headcount on a technical writer. I remember my salary conversation with Mark Peratt where he said, "So you make this X amount at Apple. Do you go through all of that?" I said, "Yes." I don't know. So, anyway,
Yeah, I mean, when I left academia, I spent a year in industry as a technical writer, and you got in those. I mean, they'd handed me the finished thing and said, "Okay, now you write the documentation." So I didn't have a clue, right? And that's so different from your experience.
yeah, and it's incredibly valuable to I mean, the earlier you can get there as the person documenting it, the better job you can do because you can do more rewrites and you can see the software evolve or the product evolve. You can see the dead ends, and then when you're explaining the way it is now, you understand how it got there, and so you can be more informative. And I think, actually, now that I think about it, um, Apple, on the Macintosh kind of worked that way in that they had several technical writers led by Caroline Rose, working on Inside Macintosh, which is the programming documentation for the Mac, very early on. And um, they went through many, many drafts of the docs as the software evolved. And I've heard Andy, I wasn't around at the time, but I've heard Andy talk about how, if Caroline couldn't explain how something worked, they redesigned it because they knew it wasn't simple or powerful or well structured enough. So in that way, the writer actually affected, the design of the products, and was a designer. Now, not every technical writer is Caroline Rose. There's only one of her, but if you choose well, then having a writer in early can pay off.
What was the hardest thing to explain both to developers and to the partners when when you were doing that explaining and seeing if the design was simple enough?
Well, I worked mainly on Magic Cap, and Magic Cap is a, a direct descendant of, um, the graphical user interface frameworks we all worked on and knew at Apple. So that was relatively straightforward. I worked a little bit on Telescript. That was a lot harder because it wasn't the descendant of anything that was popular. And in particular, I remember, my fellow writer David Slew saying, "We're we're writing about air travel in the 1700s." We're, and I said, "Yeah, it's essentially science fiction," because we were writing about, um, networks and agents, uh, and there weren't any. Unlike Magic Cap, I had trouble conceptualizing it, and so did everybody else, really. So, I just remember one day having an aha moment and realizing I like to oversimplify. That's how I get my best insights. And just realizing, oh, these are little programs that go out in the network and do things and talk to other little programs out in the network. Just that simplification helped me start to grok it. Gosh, can you still say grok? I hope so. It means something else now. Just, once I figure out the super simplification, then I can often explain it. But I think the hardest thing to explain was maybe what we'd now call agentic behavior, just agents going out into the cloud and doing something independently with a manifest and a list of rules that they have to follow. That was that was the most futuristic.
I think of Microsoft, and back when we were building Magic and building the Alliance, well, the Alliance was against the Axis, which was Microsoft and IBM. Was there culture shock when you got to Redmond? It was the Borg, right? Back in the 90s. How did that feel?
Yeah, definitely culture difference, occasionally culture shock. So I worked in the Mac group at Microsoft, which was in, Mountain View, and, I remember when the recruiter called and I called her back and she said, "Wow, none of the Mac people ever call me back." Uh, but it was kind of the dawn of the browser era of the internet, and, um, I I wanted to find out what was going on. Um, our group in Mountain View was led by a guy named Don Bradford, who was ex-Apple, and his whole team was ex-Apple, and Don made it a point to keep us away from Redmond physically and spiritually. So, my contact with the actual Borg was fairly limited. Like, I remember, when I started, I was telling the admin there, "Oh, I got an email to go to Redmond for training, for orientation," and she said, "Oh, yeah, don't worry, we'll take care of that." So, um, we were Borg super light, very light, but occasionally. For example, that was the group that worked on Internet Explorer for Macintosh. We got the word that our next version had to have the Windows logo in the corner as the progress bar, and, no. that can't happen. So, we had a little fight about that, and but Don did a great job of keeping us separate, and it paid off because, Microsoft for several years wrote some really good Macintosh software against all odds. But I also I love I'm a cultural anthropologist and amateur, and I used to love to, when I finally did get to Redmond, just kinda walk around at night, walk around the buildings and the campus just to see how this company grew up and how it was different from the other companies I had been at. You know, because it has a rich history. It's not, one that I am like, I'm glad I wasn't there for a lot of it, but it's fun just to what do they put up on the walls? What kind of projects are people working on? Um, and it was very, very different in very many ways, and, you know, I did the same thing at Google, and now, uh, I haven't been at these companies for a while, but things started to get locked down even for employees. Like, when I left Google, there were starting to be, like, silos of, based on the org chart. You know, if you worked in building A, you didn't have access to building B, and I think Apple pioneered a lot of that, but, I guess Microsoft is probably the same way, and so, for folks like me who like to skulk around and see what's going on unofficially at night, I don't know that you can do that anymore.
What's the sequence of your titles? You know, because at Magic, we had whimsical titles, right?
Right.
I mean, what if you had to lay out your business cards in sequence, did they get more and more austere and businesslike, you know?
I tried not to. I actually did lay them all out for a Substack post a couple of years ago, but no, they stayed pretty. They usually had something to do with writer, but I tried to have fun with them now and then too. My card at Magic said communicator because we made communicators, and I felt like I was one, so I thought that was appropriate. Um, when I was very young, my card said boy guru. Um, and once I was exception handler because that's a microprocessor thing. And when I was managing a tech support group, I felt like if something went wrong, that's when got involved. If everything was going well, I I stayed away. But and then my favorite whimsical card was at Google when I was in my late 50s. I made my card say 63rd oldest Googler. No, 73rd oldest Googler, for my title, and they didn't care, they approved whimsical titles, and that was actually an educated guess. Um, at the time, internally, you could get decade info on employee ages, so I knew how many people were in their 50s and above, and I knew how many people the company employed, and I was toward the end of my 50s, so I just guessed, and I guessed 73rd oldest. And that was a real conversation starter because some people thought they assumed it was accurate. Some people didn't understand what I meant. And then business cards became passé. So,
Yeah.
It's you have to save it for your bumper sticker or personalized plate. I want to
right.
recall the story. I know you're the storyteller, but I remember after you
So
had
are
just
you.
well, one of us, that being you, is good at it. But we'll see how I do on this one. I remember after you joined Microsoft, we had lunch after you'd come back from Redmond for a company meeting. I think it was
I
an
did
all
get
hands.
there eventually.
Yeah. And you said all these guys care about is the win. They don't care about a vision. They don't care about helping the world. It's just look at the revenue and the profit, and it's just a really simple yardstick. And I remember feeling not that that was an evil way to think about the world, but it just seemed so cold and soulless. And yet there was Microsoft still in business, and warm and fuzzy, cuddly General Magic was a heap of ashes. So that was the story that came to mind, talking about the culture shock or culture shift between General Magic and your days at Microsoft. Did it feel that way at Microsoft, or was that just kind
Yeah.
of a one-off experience?
No, in fact, I can flesh that out a little. I because I was at Apple when Apple was descending, um, you know, and when Apple and Microsoft when Steve Jobs came back and Apple was at its lowest point, and Steve connected with Bill Gates to have there be Microsoft software for the Mac. That's when I was at Microsoft, and Microsoft was pretty riding pretty high at the time. And so what I noticed culturally was, um, at Apple, it has to be cool. At Microsoft, it has to win. And that's my oversimplification of how things worked at the time. And the thing that kind of grew out of that was at Microsoft, the leadership would decide on a direction and send the message down, and at each level it would be refined, and everybody would say yep and agree and work on it. And the incentive was, well, the last time we did this, we succeeded, we did really well, so let's do that again. That formula wins. At Apple, the leadership would have a vision and send it down, and then the next level would say, oh, I know what they really want. It's this other thing, it's similar, but we need to do it this way. And then the next level down would say, that's not what they want. It'll be much better if we do it this way. And then nothing got done the way the leadership wanted it to get done. You had 1,000 cooks and none of them Tim. And um, if you had a genius somewhere doing a genius thing by themselves, that's when you had a hit product or a great success. But there was no organizational process that I could see that caused success to happen until Steve came back and became the genius at the top, and you know, Apple did not fade from the earth. Apple did okay after that. But yeah, I remember that distinctly also. And I don't think people there, myself included, thought it was soulless. It was less soulful than Apple, but I think you Apple had to back off of that soul somewhat to achieve success because you need discipline too.
Yeah, but, I would say that, we've gone from soulful to, a little less soulful to soulless to worse, in the valley these days, that winning, it's not just winning, it's about wealth, untold wealth, power, and the depredations of greed. Again, you can contest that if you don't see, but I mean, but that's my sense of the where things what the broiarchy has wrought in the valley. Nobody cares about people or customers or anything else. They care about money and winning.
I don't think that's wrong. The only thing I would say there are maybe there are hopeful spots. Maybe there are people that don't feel that way, and I'm might have trouble naming any, but, but just I'm just too optimistic and too much of an optimist and even a Pollyanna to accept that it's totally universal, but it's the preponderance for sure. Um,
You were at Google when this transformation was underway. Did you see that happening, or am I over dramatizing it?
um, I definitely saw things change when I went there. So I got there in just after the IPO, tragically for me, in let's see, 2006. And, you know, Don't Be Evil was sincere. It was absolutely created and utilized in all sincerity. Um, I wasn't there when Google figured out how to sell ads, but my understanding is that a lot of the early engineers, just like engineers now, didn't like ads, didn't like the idea. So they made sure that the ads were relevant and were clearly marked and were not intermixed with search results. And whatever evil it was to put ads on search results was reduced to the minimum evil. I don't know, maybe. and over time, I think there was tension to, just like there's always the bug in capitalism is you got to keep growing, and so that means sometimes old lines that used to exist are crossed. And I want to think that Google still maintains some of those lines, and I think they do, but at the same time, things have been pushed a lot, and Google used to strictly be opt-in for new technologies and ideas and features, and, I don't feel fully opted in. I don't feel like I get to opt in to stuff all the time now. Um, and then for me, I left Google in 2022. I think it was a year later that Google did their layoffs, their massive, the first real substantial layoffs in the most cruel and random, apparently random way possible. The way where you show up for work, and if you haven't checked your personal email at 5 a.m., your badge doesn't work, and the security guard tells you something. I don't know. And I think a lot of people, myself included, believed that there was enough "don't be evil" left, that that wouldn't happen there, that it happened at other places. Um, And so, to me, that was a massive milestone, and I thought a lot about the people who were laid off that I had worked with, but also about the managers left behind who lost half their groups with um, no say in who was going or why. It was a really, I think a turning point.
I'm fascinated by that, um, Scott, because what you're describing in my mind is an inflection point, right? Upon a time, it would have been this way, but in that moment, it was the other way. Did you have a sense when you were there of a shift? And whether you did or you didn't, do you have a theory of how those shifts occur in the human beings who are in leadership and who evolve in a certain way for better or for worse?
Size corrupts. Uh, Google held on to its its soul longer than it should have been able to. When I started, there were over 10,000 employees, and yet every week there was a company-wide meeting, um, with the founders who would answer literally any question, and usually with direct, real answers, and, I was amazed that they could do that, and the information didn't leak, and they trusted us, and, so we got to ask those sorts of questions and get those sorts of answers. And that was in 2006, and then over time, maybe it took 10 years, that began to break down. Um, there were leaks of information. Um, the people started gaming the the ability to ask questions. They used it to push their project or just get some fame internally. And then people started surreptitiously live streaming the meetings, which made no sense to me. What could you possibly get out of that? And eventually, the rules of the meeting changed drastically, and it just so I think it happened over time, and I felt like it was inevitable, given the numbers of people, the size of the company. So, size corrupts, size perverted the mission, and I think that led to big changes at Google. That and like I said, the bug in capitalism that says if you do only as well this year as you did last year, you're failing. So inevitably you have to cross lines and do new things that you weren't willing to do a year ago.
Steve was a client of ours, my law firm, my original law firms after he left Apple. And literally the week we made the AmLaw 100 and hired our 100th lawyer, he came to lunch and was talking. And he said, when a company hits 100 people, it's dead. We all just sat there and went, oh, because to us, it was like, we'd met, a success milestone, right?
Sure. I'm sure you guys know the term, building edifice complex. in the valley, when you get your big building, it's all over. All the good stuff happens in in the small startup building. So
Well, I wanted to go back to your days at Apple, and you have, I think, some stories and some firsthand experience, or certainly observed Steve Jobs. And what I'm curious about is the gap between the wizard and the guy who was behind the curtain. There's mythology, and part of what storytellers do, I suppose, is create or pass along myths, but there's a gap between the myth and reality. The founder motif is, that mythology reigns supreme, I think, still. What did you see behind the curtain that wasn't congruent with that mythology?
well, first I have to disclaim my Steve Jobs knowledge. It's fairly limited, um, in terms of personal interaction, but man, I thought about it a lot, and I've talked to a lot of people about that in particular, and I will be completely non-mythological in saying that, um, well, Steve Jobs was a human being, as far as I know, and he was extraordinary, singular. And it's hard to describe in what ways. Um, he had an intuition about design and human taste that uh, I've never seen anybody else have. But he had the ability to transmit his vision through other people who could do what he wanted them to do, and then iterate until it matched not necessarily the first thing he thought of, but the thing that he thought was best. Um, and I don't think any of that is a lie or mythology. He really, really was. He really did have that ability to invent things in his head, imagine how they ought to be, and guess correctly. He figured out through whatever power he possessed what would be the best right way to do things. Not 100% of the time, maybe 97% of the time. He loved the round mouse. Nobody else wanted a round mouse. Um, but gosh, everything else, so much else that he nailed. And not to cite another failure, but he was probably utopian enough to not think of the social media um, tech bro hell we've ended up in either, um, because he was. I think utopian is the perfect word for him, Mike, because he saw technology as a way for people to do more and get better and get happier. Uh, Based on personal interaction, I saw him be unsure of a thing or two, which you didn't see in public too much, but I believe it's true. I feel like there are rules of Steve Jobs stories. Um, uh, any story with Steve Jobs in it becomes a Steve Jobs story. If you say, um, I swam the length of the Mississippi, and when I climbed out, Steve Jobs was there, that becomes a Steve Jobs story. He's the most interesting character in the story. And another rule is there is always one more Steve Jobs story, and people have an insatiable demand for them. Somebody, especially in this era when there's infinite space for people to tell stories, someone will say, "Oh, I had this meeting with Steve Jobs," and then that story will become uh, very popular. Within a few days, it'll spread around social media because it's a Steve Jobs story. I wrote an hour long stage show about my experiences in Silicon Valley with like this much Steve Jobs in it. He took over my show because he's so interesting. He he's he's the most interesting human being I can think of in the last 75 years, counting evil people, good people, inventors, business people. Um, he and I found that I would do this show for people who weren't in tech. It was mostly about things in tech, and at the end of the show, they'd say, "What was Steve Jobs like?" And Steve Jobs was like 5% of the show because, like I said, I haven't spent that much time with him, but he's fascinating and he deserves it. And want to hear a real quick Steve Jobs
Of
story?
course,
Uh,
of
I,
course.
I
Oh,
used to
yeah.
go. I used to go to the Apple shareholders meetings back when those happened in physical space, and the main reason I went was Steve was there, and you'd get a little bit of Steve. He'd come on at the end and do Q&A, and one year he was up there looking not really happy to be there. And the first question was, "Steve, what keeps you up at night?" And he said, "Having to answer questions at the shareholders meeting." That was his whole answer. Then the next person got up and said, "Steve, I'm worried because the Mac only has 5% market share. And how can we succeed as shareholders of this company when the Mac is only 5% of the market?" Steve said, "Market share isn't everything. Take your car, for example. What do you have, a Mercedes?" And she said, "Yes, yes, I have a Mercedes." I said, "Well, Mercedes has a lower than 5% market share, but they're doing fine." And I'm like, how did he pin it on Mercedes? It didn't seem like he knew her. He's not going to plant a shill in the audience. But that's the time when I think maybe he was something more than a human being. But I think he was just a super extraordinary person, and uh, he had uh, he was not perfect, and he did things that were less than perfect. But I also think he grew and changed over his life, like so many of us do, and matured and became a better human being and a better business person. Um, I don't think the stories about him are often exaggerated. I think most of them are well earned and deserved.
Did you feel any sort of kinship with Apple when you were there that flowed through Steve? I mean, did you feel that, he was the leader and that he had a charisma that infused what you and your colleagues were doing there?
Absolutely. Um, when I went there in '83, and I felt that way uh, about him. And then when the Macintosh came out and didn't succeed, and he left the company in '85, I was bereft because he seemed to be the soul, the not just the product guy, but the person who understood what we were doing. Apple, had become, as often happens with founders, uh, Apple was like a physical manifestation of what he wanted to do, what he thought. Woz was the technical genius, um, but really kind of through the Apple II, sort of the Apple III, which had Apple II heritage, um, and not so much the Mac. Steve was there the whole time, and so yeah, when he was there, you felt like he was running the show. And if if you didn't think so, he might show up, and then you would know for sure. And yeah, when he left, it was, Apple became soulless and directionless until he came back. The evidence is pretty clear.
I want to pivot to talking about the dark side of the force with respect to Apple and what it wrought in General Magic. What General Magic, you could say, helped put in motion in terms of what Mike was alluding to earlier: surveillance capitalism, a increasingly polarized society, mass disinformation, and the list goes on. Why do you think at General Magic we didn't consider those possibilities? And I want to before you answer, I remember you once saying to me, human beings get into trouble when they forget that they're animals. And certainly technology has enabled the baser instincts of humans to, in certain places, run supreme. So, why wasn't it on our radar to kind of think through the worst case scenarios and take steps to try to head those off before they metastasized?
Maybe because we were not people who would ever do that. Maybe because all we thought about was the utopian vision, the positive part of it. And I mean, speaking for myself, um, not only was I extremely young, but I was very naive. Um, Now I'm still naive, and I just don't think it didn't occur to us. You know, the people who invented email didn't think about spam. And I think in a lot of cases, until maybe 10, 15 years ago, technologists fail to envision the worst uses of their technology. I was at Apple when the virus was invented. Nobody saw that coming. And um, an, another magician, Jim Friedlander, was pulled aside into a small team. Maybe he was the whole team to figure out how to deal with viruses and antivirus. Nobody that I know of at Apple ever warned that this could happen. That you know a malicious piece of code could get on your computer and do something to it. Nobody thought about spam. I think that surveillance capitalism, and even worse, just surveillance for evil, i- isn't something that anybody warned about that I ever heard about, and certainly not at General Magic in the early days. Because for one thing, you need online ubiquity. Like nothing that we have today would ever work if the whole world and all our communications and documentation hadn't migrated to online. When the web browser started, and somebody said, "Hey, this author has made his book available online, or you can watch this video and it's online." That was a rare exception. Um, to imagine like that government offices uh, and libraries and content companies would by default put things online, maybe behind a paywall, maybe free newspapers online for free. Nobody could have imagined that early on. So once everything was online, it enabled some bad things too, like more surveillance and and more um, the modern successors of viruses, internet worms, and ransomware, horrible things. So I think for starters, we were all sweet and innocent. Not you, Tom, but I know, but it got to a point. There was a point eventually when you couldn't launch something online without a threat model and mitigation for the potential threats, and that was at least as much work as making the thing work in the first place. And people who are inventing cool new things, they don't want to do that work if they don't have to. Maybe that's another reason too. I don't know that anybody um, at General Magic thought about, well, what if somebody hijacks your device and there's an agent that goes and buys things for you in the cloud? How do we prevent that? I mean, Telescript had limits built in and thought about that, but and certainly uh, Jim White and Rich Miller and their team thought about threats and how to mitigate them, but maybe we didn't think enough. Maybe we underestimated the evil ingenuity of the human race
Yeah,
because they
we
got
there's something we pondered as well, a failure of imagination, and, except for me, I think you're right. People at General Motors were well-intentioned, good-hearted people. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough juice at that place for my dark heart and malicious take on everything to help inform product
see,
design, but,
there you go. You,
here we
you,
are.
But I wanted to circle back one little bit. What, in your hour-long show, what General Magic, anecdotes did you use? What were the juiciest bits from those days?
well, I went more for fun than juice, but, but my fun General Magic, um, story in that show is, the night of the 2 AM, Charles Irby speech when we had to finish a release of, Magic Cap and Telescript and deliver it to AT&T that morning, or we would miss a deadline and miss a payment probably. Um, and engineers had been and everybody, we had a test marathon all week. People were banging on it, and, it wasn't in great shape. And we had a meeting, and everybody was still there. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, we all gathered in the big room, and, Charles Irby was our newly acquired VP of technology, I think?
Engineering, yeah, right. He was, yeah.
Engineering, yeah. And, he called on people in the room to give their impressions. And, one person said, um, "It's okay," and the next person said, "It's awful," and the next person said, "It crashed 5 times in the hour that I was using it." And it kinda went on like that for not that long, 10, 15 minutes, and then at the end, he said, I've heard what everybody says. We are a partnership. We have a partner. They're expecting this tomorrow, and I think we're gonna go ahead and ship it." And then he walked out of the room. So that was my story in that context. Oh, and, actually, there's a lighthearted moment in there too, which is, one engineer in particular who was very a low-level engineer, um, about 1 AM, I was walking and he was walking, and we got to a corner, and we both came around the corner, and we're both exhausted, and we did that thing where I move to the right, but he moves to the right, and I then go like this, and he goes like this, and then he just stopped moving, and he said, "I'm too tired to calculate the optimal path."
Well, that was exactly the problem. We were too tired collectively to
Yes.
calculate the
Yes,
optimal. You
yes,
know,
we
I
were.
um a question from left field. What makes for a good story?
Ah, wow, how would I know? It there has to be a point. The point should be it should come to a point. It should be structured so that the best stuff comes at the end, but on the way, there are highlights. It should be clear, um, like like a Bill Atkinson piece of code. It should be like don't leave people thinking, "What did he mean by that?" Because then they'll think about that and they'll miss the rest of the story. Um, inflection. Um, it's great if it's a first person story. That's the best. That's why I kind of refrain from stories about like there are great stories all over tech and everywhere. There's a wonderful story about Steve Jobs going to Japan and defending uh, women executives he had come with when whoever he was meeting with uh, didn't want to see them. But it's not my story, so I don't really tell it. In fact, the whole premise of my Substack is every story must contain me. So even if it's fairly mundane otherwise, um, and I do it. I write the things I want to. If when other people enjoy them, I'm thrilled, especially when they engage, in comments or tell me. But it's stuff that happened to me. So I think if you can tell stories about stuff that happened to you, that's a head start. If you're really good, you can tell stories about other people, other things, but put yourself in there somewhere. So that's
You've written 17 books according to our research.
yeah.
Which is your favorite child? Dickens wrote 13 and David Copperfield was his. Which do you have a favorite child?
I have to say it's my first one. It's called How to Write Macintosh Software, and I it came out when before there was a lot of Mac documentation, but there were a lot of people who wanted to write Mac programs, and I was in this. I was lucky to be in this wonderfully unique place where I worked at Apple. My job was helping developers. There were thousands of people who wanted to know this stuff, and there was not a good channel to get it to them. There was no internet. There wasn't even really email. So there were books. And I was lucky that I was in the one place on earth where I could gain this knowledge working at Apple, and that I had the ability to put it into words, and then a publisher that would put it out in the world. And it was so great to do that and get the reaction from people. And you know, it it's not an exaggeration to say it gave me a career. Uh, Job after job, when I interviewed, uh, someone was familiar with that book. Someone had learned to program the Macintosh reading that book, and now they were at Google or Microsoft or uh, a startup, or it just happened over and over again. That's how I got connected with Dan Winkler and ended up at General Magic. So, and it's also probably the most insightful book I wrote. My books are all technical, um, and I dove deep. I learned. Well, I already knew because it was my job. I I I really had to do very little research. All I did was just put into words on paper what I knew from my job, and that's my favorite for all those reasons. Sorry, other books. That's I did I also really liked, a book that my wife wrote about, Magic Cap called Presenting Magic Cap, um, that I, maybe developmental edited or read because, um, it tries to be a book that encapsulates the beauty and the fun of a Magic Link, a Magic Cap device, because it's filled with screenshots and all those gorgeous screens that Susan Kerr designed and that Andy and Bill and Darren made are it's almost like a brochure, a giant brochure of those screens, and it comes to life. It's small, so it fits the size of the um, of the device. And I didn't write it, but I'm very fond of that book.
Yeah, I still have my copy.
See?
Would be remiss not to ask you about your Substack. You've talked about it a little bit, but just how that came to be, what inspires you, how frequently you updated, any notable greatest hits, and other things that I'm sure our audience would appreciate knowing about.
Sure, sure. Um, about 10 years ago, when I worked at Google, I had a boss named Louis Gray, who was a prolific blogger, and he knew and maybe appreciated all my old timey stories. Um, and he encouraged me to blog them. So I started a blogger blog, and I started writing them um, a couple a week, maybe. And I wrote maybe a couple dozen of them, and it was fun. I loved it. And then that stopped. And then, as I mentioned, I got into theater and told some stories on stage at different venues. And then, I guess about a year and a half ago, I decided I wanted to write all the stories that I knew seriously before I started forgetting, because you forget details or entire stories. So I happened to be talking to my old boss, Guy Kawasaki at the time, and asked for advice. And he said, start a Substack." And it seemed like a good idea. It was free. It seemed like it had plenty of features. It was rising in popularity. I didn't much care where I put it, but that seemed like a good place to put it. So I just started writing. The first thing I did was I sat down and brainstormed um, my own stories, and I listed over 200 ideas that I thought could be posts. I was doing 2 a week, and I didn't ever want to have anyone else giving me pressure about how often or what, or like I didn't ever want a comment or an email saying that was dumb. Why do you write about that? I guess that was dumb is okay, but please don't write about that anymore because I'm doing it for me, and it's just so much fun to revisit old stories or write stories down that I never wrote before. And I have to admit that I enjoy rereading old ones. Um, I enjoy having Substack read them out loud to me. It'll do that. And that's, I don't know if that's the ultimate ego trip or not. I kind of wish it would do that with a draft, because then if you left out a word or something, it's easier to catch it if you miss it, but it won't do it for a draft. I hope they add that feature.
Can you
Um,
choose the voice?
I don't think so. I think it seems to choose a male or female voice based on the author. Um, I tried asking, a couple of chatbots to write a post for me. Said, "Write a
That was
post
yeah, that
in
was
my
gonna be
like,
the next question.
in my voice." It was awful.
But do you use AI? Do you use AI at all when you're writing?
I When I'm writing, well, I use it when I'm done writing. I use it for, I ask it to check grammar and spelling, and, sometimes it's right. Sometimes it'll say, "You misspelled this word," and I'll look at the word and it's not misspelled. But once in a while, um, it catches something, a missing word or a wrong capitalization or something like that. So uh, I use it to proofread. Um, I In addition to it not doing a good job of writing a story for me, um, I don't want that. I enjoy the writing. I have no need. I feel fortunate that I don't need to use or don't want to use that aspect of AI. I use AI a lot for learning things. As for one that sticks out, um, I have a post. Some of my posts are not about technology at all. One of them is about a photo of the 1956 Denver Bears baseball team, minor league baseball team. It used to sit in my dad's office, and I used to sit in that office and stare at that photo. And when he sold the place, I took it with me, and I came across it here at home one day, and I looked at it some more, and I saw um, Tommy Lasorda, Marv Throneberry, other familiar names. This was 1956 in the minor leagues. So I decided to write a post about what happened to these guys. And, this one, I did use more AI than probably others. I used it for research. And I found out there were, in addition to Tommy Lasorda, who's in the Hall of Fame and won 2 World Series, um, there are other Hall of Famers in the picture. There are pennant-winning managers. There are all-stars. There's a guy who went to work for an electronics company. Just all these stories, great and small. My favorite story was the Bat Boy. The Bat Boy, um, I found his obituary, and in his obituary, um, he transitioned to a woman. He was he was he was trans. His family and he used all pronouns with him, and he was cool with that. He was very casual about it. And there's a photo uh, from the obituary, and it's the same face as the Bat Boy, the same smiling face. You know, decades later, 60 years later, but the same smiling face. It's the same person. Obituary written about his by his loving family, by his loving uh, niece, about how he taught them all to cook, and he, like I said, he was extremely casual. They called him aunt, uncle, aunt. Sometimes he just seemed so relaxed with his presence on Earth. And I wrote about that with all the baseball Hall of Famers, um, this person emerged as the star of the story. So, and then the next thing I thought, well, this should be a musical, but I didn't get that far.
Scott, for those not familiar with you, I think that that story that you just recounted is so lovely in your recounting of it, because I've always thought, I was thinking about this before the show, and the phrase that popped into my mind was a gentle eye for the absurd, that you have story after story, have strange twists or kind of magical moments, not necessarily epiphanies, but things take an unexpected turn that in the end out to be a delightful one. So I hope that there are other stories like that, and I can't recommend the Substack highly enough. Now,
Thank you. I appreciate that so much because that's exactly what I'm going for. I feel like the universe puts these things out in front of me, and I don't know if I get more of them than most people, but maybe I notice them, and this is part of my like, I have to share it. If I see something hilarious, absurd, um, I can't keep it to myself. My wife knows very well, and that's really what the Substack is for. Is telling these stories um, uh, that are hilarious or absurd or a sign that has a weird typo, and it's worth putting out. Oh, and I should also say my Substack is called Occasionally Misses Expectations, which was my frequent review grade when I was at Google.
That's
well,
great.
that brings us to one of two important matters that we've not gotten to. First of all, we have a almost no profanity rule in the interviews. There's always the checkbox that has to be marked off, ticked off, which is me using profanity once in the interview. So it's fucking great to see you, and we can check that one. Number two, we like a guest to provide the bumper sticker that they think summarizes or encapsulates who they are, what they've done, or just whatever strikes their fancy that they would put on the back of their car. So, what is the Scott Knaster bumper sticker?
Adjacent to greatness.
There you
That's
go.
my whole career. My whole career is I worked with Bill Atkinson and Andy Hertzfeld, and I worked with Andy Rubin and Tony Fadell, and I was near Steve Jobs, and you know, Bill Gates directed my group, but what did I do? I wrote a book once. So I'm thrilled to be. In fact, yeah, adjacent to greatness would be me.
Well, and great yourself. I say you're one of the master storytellers of the Valley and of the industry in general. It was great to have you. We're out of time at this point. Thanks so much for being here and for sharing some of your great stories with us. So,
My pleasure, Mike. Anytime, Tom. Great to talk to you as well, and uh, really, it was a blast.
Thank you for listening to General Magic and the Soul of Tech podcast. Tune into our Substack for more interviews and articles at spellboundproductions.substack.com.